Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that might sound a little um, dry at first, a
Oh,
math class, but trust me, this is going to be anything bitty boring.
yeah.
You shared some excerpts from Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics
Right.
by Peter Liljedahl, and we're about to explore how to turn those yawn-inducing lectures into dynamic spaces where
Yeah.
students actually think.
It's a fascinating shift, isn't it? The book challenges some of those really deeply ingrained assumptions we have about
Yeah.
how math should be taught. Liljedahl argues that traditional classrooms often stifle deep thinking,
Hmm.
and he offers a research-backed framework for change.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but also a little skeptical. Can we really change the way math has been taught, well, forever?
That's the beauty of this book. It's not just theoretical. Liljedahl provides a concrete toolkit for teachers to create
Okay.
what he calls thinking classrooms.
Well,
And one of the most surprising findings is about when you present a math problem.
now that you mention it, I do remember that from the excerpts.
Mhm.
It goes against everything
It does.
we've been taught, right? Give a lecture, show some examples, then assign problems.
Exactly. But Liljedahl says that by giving the problem before any instruction,
Oh, wow.
you can spark their curiosity and force them to think independently. And imagine like being handed a puzzle without knowing all the pieces or
Right.
techniques. Your brain immediately starts searching for solutions, right?
It does make sense, but wouldn't that just lead to a room full of confused and frustrated students?
It could if you just throw any old problem at them. That's why Liljedahl emphasizes the
Ugh.
importance of thinking tasks,
Yeah.
problems that are engaging,
Yeah.
and just challenging enough that
Yeah.
students can start working on them even without prior instruction.
So like that gold chain task example from the book, the one where students have to figure out how to pay for a hotel using a gold chain with limited cuts.
Exactly.
That sounds more like a riddle than a math problem.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so brilliant. It hooks their interest, and they're already thinking mathematically
Okay.
before you've even introduced the concepts.
Okay, so we've got the right task. We present it before instruction. What happens next?
This is where it
Yeah.
gets even more interesting. Liljedahl encourages teachers to become deliberately
Oh,
less helpful when students inevitably start asking questions.
less helpful. Isn't the teacher's role to guide and support?
Absolutely. But it's about the kind of support.
I see.
Instead of providing step-by-step instructions or confirming every answer,
Yeah.
redirect those questions back to the students or to their classmates.
So if a student asks, is this right?
Mhm.
You might say, what do your group members think?
Exactly. This builds autonomy and resourcefulness.
Mm-hmm.
It encourages students to rely on their own thinking and on each other, rather than always looking to the teacher for validation.
I'm starting to see how this all fits together, but I can't help but picture a traditional classroom set up desks in rows,
Right.
students quietly working in their notebooks.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem very conducive to this kind of
Right.
active collaborative learning.
You're right. The physical environment matters. Liljedahl recommends ditching notebooks and having students work on vertical, non-permanent surfaces,
Oh,
like whiteboards or large sheets of paper.
What's the thinking behind that? Seems pretty radical to get rid of notebooks entirely.
It's all about making thinking visible
Yeah.
and encouraging dynamic group work. When students work on whiteboards, their thought processes are out in the open for everyone to see and build on.
So instead of mistakes being hidden away in a notebook, they become learning opportunities for the whole group.
Precisely. Plus, working on vertical surfaces reduces individual anxiety. No one feels like they're being put on the spot
Right.
because everyone's work is equally visible.
And it promotes collaboration.
Right.
Students can literally see what other groups are doing
Yeah.
and maybe even get inspired by different approaches.
Exactly. Liljedahl calls this knowledge mobility, and it's a key element of a thinking classroom.
So far, we've covered the right tasks, the timing, the less helpful teacher, and these vertical surfaces.
Right.
What else makes up a thinking classroom?
Another critical component is how you form groups. Liljedahl is a strong advocate for frequent
Yeah.
and visibly random grouping.
Visibly random, so not just assigning groups arbitrarily,
Yeah.
but making sure the students see that it's random.
You got it. Think playing cards, dice, a random name generator. The key is that students understand there's no hidden agenda
Got it.
in the group formation. Everyone has an equal chance of working with anyone else.
I see the value in that. But how does random grouping transform the classroom dynamic?
Well, think about it. In traditional classrooms, students often stick with their friends or gravitate towards those they perceive as smart.
Right, right.
This reinforces existing social dynamics and limits who they interact with.
It's like the same small groups working together over and over again.
Exactly. Random grouping disrupts those patterns and creates opportunities to interact
Yeah.
with classmates they might not normally choose. This forces them to communicate, negotiate, and consider diverse perspectives.
And you said this also promotes knowledge mobility.
Absolutely. When you're constantly working with new people, ideas flow more freely
Mm.
throughout the classroom. Imagine, like, a bee pollinating flowers,
Very
things like
true.
that.
Yeah.
Students aren't just relying on the same small pool of knowledge within their usual group.
So they're exposed to different approaches, strategies, ways of thinking, which is essential for deep learning.
Exactly. It's not just about who they work with, but how they work together.
This is fascinating. So we've got the random groups, the vertical surfaces, but even in this ideal setup,
Right.
once students still fall back on those stop thinking questions like,
Oh, yeah.
is this right? Am I doing this correctly?
You're absolutely right. And those questions can be even more frequent in a collaborative setting where students are constantly checking in with each other.
Right.
But in a thinking classroom, you handle those questions differently.
By being less helpful, as we discussed earlier.
Hmm.
But how do you strike that balance between providing support and fostering independence, especially when a whole group is stuck?
That's where Liljedahl introduces a technique that might sound a little strange at first.
Uh-oh.
Smiling and walking away.
Smiling and walking away. I'm picturing something out of a sitcom.
It might seem counterintuitive,
Right.
but it's incredibly effective. When a student or a group asks a stop thinking question,
Okay.
acknowledge them with a smile, maybe a quick, interesting,
Yeah.
and then simply walk away.
So you're not ignoring them, but you're also not giving them the answer. It's like saying, I hear you, but I trust you to figure this out.
Exactly. And what's remarkable is that students often do just that. They need that little nudge to
Yeah.
activate their own thinking processes. And the absence of the teacher's immediate intervention, right, forces them to rely on their own resources.
It's like you're giving them the space to struggle productively, which is where real learning happens.
Mm-hmm.
But what if a group is genuinely stuck, not just asking for confirmation? Do we just let them flounder?
Not at all. This is where that knowledge mobility we talked about comes in. You might suggest they check out what other groups are doing, or even ask another group for a hint.
So instead of being the sole source of information, you're encouraging them to tap into the collective knowledge of the classroom.
Precisely. And this creates a dynamic where everyone is both a learner and a teacher,
Yeah.
supporting each other's growth.
This is incredibly insightful. We've covered so much already. The importance of choosing the right tasks, the power of random grouping,
Right.
creating a visible thinking space, and even handling those tricky student questions in a way that promotes thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But I know there's more to Liljedahl's framework. What else should we consider?
Well, after establishing this foundation, the book dives into some really interesting deliberate actions
Interesting.
teachers can take to further foster student autonomy and deeper thinking. We'll explore those in part 2.
Sounds like a great place to pick up.
Picking up where we left off, let's talk about one of those deliberate actions that might surprise you, how Liljedahl reimagines homework.
Homework. I thought we were moving away from the traditional model of assigning problems after a lecture.
We are, and that's what makes this approach so interesting. Liljedahl suggests replacing traditional homework with what he calls check your understanding questions.
So instead of drilling concepts through repetitive exercises, it's more about self-assessment and reflection on what they learned in class.
Exactly. The goal shifts from chasing grades to students genuinely gauging their own comprehension. They pinpoint areas where they need more practice or clarification, turning homework into a tool for self-directed learning.
I can see how that would resonate with the overall philosophy of a thinking classroom. But wouldn't students just slack off if it's not about grades?
That's a common concern, but think about it. Traditional homework often encourages mimicking, not deep understanding. Students focus on getting the right answer, even if it means copying or relying heavily on notes.
They're not really engaging with the material on a deeper level.
Exactly. Check your understanding. Questions. Flip the script. The focus is on reflecting on what they truly understand and identifying areas where they need more support. It becomes less about performance and more about personal growth.
It's like embedding a formative assessment right into their learning process.
Precisely. And it helps students develop those metacognitive skills that awareness of their own learning process, they become active participants in their own learning journey.
It sounds like a win-win. Students get to solidify their understanding without the pressure of grades, and teachers gain valuable insights into where students are excelling or struggling. Speaking of practices that often get a bad rap, what about note-taking?
Note-taking, it can easily turn into a mindless exercise of copying down everything from the board.
I remember those days, endless pages of notes that I rarely looked at again. It felt like the focus was on documentation, not comprehension.
Exactly, and Liljedahl tackles this head-on. He encourages students to take notes as though they're writing to their future forgetful selves.
That's such a clever way to frame it. It transforms the purpose of note-taking from just recording information to creating a resource that's genuinely helpful down the line.
Isn't it? Imagine trying to explain a concept to someone who knows nothing about it.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just recite facts and figures. You'd use clear language examples and maybe even visuals to make it understandable. That's the mindset students should bring to note-taking.
So it's about distilling the essence of the material in a way that's meaningful to them and will actually aid their recall later on.
Precisely. Instead of copying verbatim, they're encouraged to focus on key concepts, use graphic organizers, and even add their own explanations and insights. The book offers practical tips like color coding, creating diagrams, and connecting concepts to real-life examples.
It sounds like they're creating their own personalized study guides tailored to how they learn best.
Exactly. And just like with the reimagined homework, this encourages those crucial metacognitive skills they have to think about what's truly important, how concepts connect, and how they can best represent information for future retrieval.
It's fascinating how Liljedahl rethinks these seemingly mundane classroom practices. Speaking of shaking things up, how does he approach the big one assessment?
That's where things get really interesting. Traditional assessment often boils down to points and grades, which can overshadow genuine understanding of learning outcomes.
It becomes about performance and achievement rather than the process of learning and growth.
Exactly. Liljedahl advocates for a paradigm shift from point gathering to data gathering. Instead of tallying points for every assignment, teachers should gather evidence of learning over time using a variety of methods to paint a more holistic picture of student progress.
So it's not just about how many questions a student gets right on a test, but about considering data from classroom observations, group work, those check your understanding questions, and more.
Precisely, it's about looking for patterns and trends in their learning, not just isolated instances of success or failure.
That's a much more nuanced and meaningful way to assess learning. But how do grades fit into this data-driven paradigm? Do they disappear completely?
Not necessarily, but they become more reflective of genuine learning rather than just points accumulation. Instead of simply averaging grades from various assignments, teachers analyze all the evidence they've gathered to determine the student's level of mastery for each learning outcome.
So a student's grade reflects the trajectory of their learning journey, not just a snapshot of their performance on a single test.
Exactly. It's a much fairer and more accurate way to assess progress. It recognizes that students learn at different paces and values the effort and improvement they demonstrate over time.
I'm really struck by how Liljedahl's framework challenges so many traditional classroom practices. It's not just about tweaking a few things, it's a complete transformation of how we think about teaching and learning.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a fundamental mindset shift, both for teachers and students. But it's important to acknowledge that while he champions collaboration, Liljedahl also recognizes the importance of individual learning styles and needs.
That makes sense. Not everyone thrives in a group setting all the time. How does he address that?
Remember those meaningful notes we discussed earlier? That practice where students write to their future forgetful selves is a great example of nurturing individual thinking within a collaborative classroom. Students process information in a way that makes sense to them, forging their own personal understanding.
And even during group work, there's still individual accountability.
Absolutely. Each student is responsible for contributing to the group's success, for sharing their ideas, and for ensuring they understand the concepts. The goal is to leverage the group's collective wisdom to deepen individual understanding, not to rely on others for all the answers.
It's about finding that sweet spot between collaboration and independent thinking. Speaking of finding the right balance, we talked earlier about how Liljedahl encourages teachers to be less helpful by redirecting questions and encouraging peer support. But what about those moments when a group or even an individual student is genuinely stuck and needs a nudge in the right direction?
That's where his concept of hints and extensions comes in. It's a strategic approach where the level of support is tailored to the group's or individual's current understanding.
So instead of giving away the solution, The hint might point them towards a helpful strategy, a relevant concept, or even just a new way to frame the problem.
Exactly. It's about providing just enough support to keep them moving forward without robbing them of the aha moment of discovering the solution themselves. And on the flip side, extensions offer additional challenges to groups or individuals who've already solved the problem.
So everyone is working on the same core concept, but the level of challenge is adjusted to keep them engaged and learning at their own pace.
Precisely this strategic use of hints and extensions ties into another fascinating aspect of Liljedahl's framework, creating a state of flow in the classroom.
Flow like being in the zone.
Exactly. It's that feeling of being completely absorbed in an activity so engrossed that you lose track of time. Think about those times you've gotten lost in a good book, a challenging game, or a creative project.
It's when you're fully immersed and challenged, but not overwhelmed.
Exactly. And research has shown that flow is a powerful state for learning. It boosts motivation, engagement, and even enjoyment. Liljedahl believes that by striking the right balance between challenge and skill, we can create flow in the classroom.
That makes sense, but wouldn't that require a highly individualized approach? How can you create flow for a whole classroom of students with different abilities and learning styles?
It's all about creating a dynamic and responsive environment. The strategic use of hints and extensions we discussed earlier, combined with the power of collaborative groups, plays a crucial role. Teachers act as facilitators, observing groups and providing individualized support as needed.
So one group might be working on the core problem, another group is tackling an extension, and yet another group is receiving a targeted hint to overcome a specific obstacle.
Precisely. And as teachers hone their observation skills and become adept at providing differentiated support, they create an environment where everyone is challenged, engaged, and working in their own flow zone.
That's a powerful image, but I imagine it requires a lot of skill and experience. How can teachers develop the expertise to implement these practices effectively?
It does take practice and reflection, but the beauty of Liljedahl's framework is that it provides a clear roadmap and practical strategies that can be implemented gradually. It's not about overhauling your entire teaching style overnight, but rather about incorporating these practices incrementally and adjusting as you go.
So it's about taking small steps, experimenting, and finding what works best for you and your students.
Exactly. The book offers a wealth of examples, anecdotes from real classrooms, and even frequently asked questions sections to address common challenges.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of thinking classrooms. We've covered so much, from reimagining homework and note-taking to shifting to a data-driven approach to assessment and even creating flow in the classroom. But I know there's even more to explore. What can we look forward to in part 3?
In the final part, we'll shift our focus from the what to the how. We'll delve into the practicalities of implementing these ideas, address potential challenges, and discuss how the principles of a thinking classroom can extend far beyond the walls of a school.
That sounds like a perfect way to wrap up our exploration. See you in part 3. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been exploring Peter Liljedahl's framework for building thinking classrooms, and I gotta say, it's been a real eye-opener. We've talked about all these exciting possibilities, but
Right.
let's get real for a moment. Implementing these ideas
Right.
can't be a walk in the park, right?
You're absolutely right. It takes a real commitment to shift away from those traditional classroom practices we're all so used to. One of the biggest hurdles, I think, is that need to let go of some control.
To step back from that sage on the stage role and
Yeah.
become more of a facilitator.
Exactly. In a thinking classroom, the teacher guides students towards discovery rather than just
Yeah.
delivering knowledge, like in a neat little package, you know?
Right.
That can be a tough transition for teachers who are used to being the primary source of information.
I bet it takes a ton of patience, too.
Yeah.
I can only imagine how tempting it would be to just jump in and give students the answer when they're struggling.
It definitely does, but trust me, the payoff is worth it. When you see that light bulb moment when students persevere through a challenge and come up with their own solutions,
Yeah.
it's incredibly rewarding.
It's about fostering those moments of genuine learning and discovery, not just memorization or mimicking.
Precisely. And the benefits extend far beyond just academic achievement. Thinking classrooms cultivate critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration,
Yep.
a love of learning,
Right.
skills that will serve students well no matter what path they choose in life.
It's about preparing them for the real world, where the answers aren't always clear-cut, and the ability to, think creatively and work together is essential.
Exactly. Now, another challenge is this approach can be pretty disruptive to the status quo.
Yeah,
It might require a shift in school culture, even in parental expectations.
I can see that parents are used to seeing worksheets, quizzes, traditional grades.
Right.
This might seem a bit
Yeah,
too radical or out there for some.
it's true. That's why communication is so crucial. Teachers need to clearly explain to parents, administrators, colleagues
Right.
why they're making these changes and what positive impacts they're seeing in student learning and engagement.
It's about sharing the vision of what a thinking classroom can be and the amazing things that can happen when we, empower students to think for themselves.
Precisely. And speaking of empowerment, one of the most inspiring aspects of Liljedahl's framework is it's not just for teachers.
That's interesting. What do you mean?
Well, think about it. The principles we've been discussing, those carefully chosen tasks, the emphasis on collaboration and problem solving, the less helpful approach to guiding learning,
Yeah.
I mean, they can be applied to any setting where people are learning and growing.
So it's not just about transforming classrooms, it's about transforming how we approach learning, like in general.
Exactly. Think about like a corporate training session, a community workshop, even a family discussion around the dinner table. You can create those like thinking moments anywhere.
It's about fostering a culture of curiosity, collaboration, intellectual exploration, no matter where we are.
Precisely. And it's about embracing those, mistakes as opportunities for growth rather than setbacks.
So it's really about shifting from a culture of mimicking to a culture of thinking. And that's something we can all strive for.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that learning is a lifelong journey, not a destination.
This has been such an inspiring deep dive. I'm walking away with so many ideas and a renewed excitement for the power of learning. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something tangible. What's one small step they can take today, whether they're a teacher, a parent, or simply someone who loves learning to start incorporating these ideas into their own lives?
That's a great question. I think the simplest yet most powerful step is to just embrace the power of questions and resist the urge to always have the right answer.
To channel that deliberately less helpful approach we talked about.
Exactly. Next time someone comes to you with a question, instead of jumping in with a solution, try asking, like, what do you think? Or what are some different ways we could approach this?
It's about encouraging people to tap into their own knowledge and problem-solving abilities.
Precisely. You might be amazed by the creativity and insight that emerges when we give people the space to think for themselves.
That's a wonderful challenge to leave our listeners with. Embrace curiosity, ask more questions, and together, let's create a world where thinking flourishes.
I love that. A world where everyone feels empowered to learn, grow, and discover.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.